Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's conference, the Market Surveillance Committee meeting. There will be no chat Q&A. All audio lines have been muted until the Q&A portion of this call. We will give you instructions on how to ask questions verbally at that time. If you require technical assistance, please reach out and chat with the event producer. With that, I turn over the call to Dr. Benjamin Hobbs. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. You can hear me. I am not muted. Apparently I am.
I can
So
hear
I'm
you.
sorry.
Okay, you're
Am
not
I
muted.
Okay, that's great. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon if you're on the East Coast, as Scott and I are. Jim Bushnell and Scott Harvey from the MSC, as well as myself, chair of the MSC, are here today, and we're going to be looking at the general issue of resource adequacy. Before I introduce that, let me also introduce the folks on line from the ISO staff, and then give an opportunity for public comment. So the other folks who've joined us from the ISO are Parther Malvadkar, who will be making a presentation later, Anya Gilbert, Abhishek Handawale, Shami Davis, Amelia Blank, and Becky Robinson. Have I missed anybody? Okay, having received no kicks to the shin under the table, I think we've got everybody. So let's start off first with public comment on any issue or questions that anybody on the phone lines might have about any matter, except if it's about RA, if you can hold it until we are addressing that topic during the agenda. So let's open up the phone lines. Yolanda, could you open up the phone line, see if there's anybody who wants to make a comment or ask a question?
Yes, we have one person on the phone line at Quito. Michelle, I'm muting them now.
Okay. Hello, Michelle.
Division. I'm not going to be able to join you for the whole thing, but I know you asked for additional agenda items at the end, and I have 2 agenda items that I would like to add if you guys would like to consider them. So the first one is that last summer during the July events, we got rid of the EIM advisory imports in the HASP. And given that we're coming upon the summer, it seems like this is ripe for discussion. I personally don't think we needed to keep it until November, but I also think that there was really important sort of policy implications and maybe economic implications of doing this. And it seems like we should have a more robust discussion about what CAISO plans to do and your thoughts about what worked and what didn't. I have my thoughts about that. So that's one thing that it would be great if you guys could put on your agenda. The additional item that I'd just like to draw your attention to, I mean, you guys maybe are more concerned about efficiency. I'm obviously concerned about reliability, but part of the resource sufficiency enhancements was about e-tagging LPT exports. And it was my understanding that we were not going to allow those e-tags to go through unless they cleared the day-ahead market. But it seems like there's sort of a step back from that. And so I just wonder, do you guys think about the reliability impacts of this? And I don't know how other markets do it when they're cutting the low priority exports, but that's really the only way we can ensure our reliability is by cutting those LPT exports. But if those instructions aren't followed, the CAISO balancing authority, in my mind, puts itself into sort of jeopardy by then having to support the LPT exports post-HASP. So these seem to me to be really important market issues that we should probably be having more robust discussions on.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Michelle, we're well aware of the issue of EIM advisory imports and disregarding them during the HASP and their continuation from the summer through November. You certainly do have implications in terms of just generally the ISO supporting a robust development of the EIM markets, and of course the the specific what are the impacts of this upon the efficiency of the markets, costs to ratepayers, and the reliability of the system. So I agree that this is something important that should be discussed, and definitely look forward to doing that at a time that we can prepare for that, and that staff, DMM, and stakeholders are given a heads up on that. We should definitely do that. And on the second one, I think we've discussed in a public meeting a little bit before our concerns about folks following instructions, and this is something also that let us get our thoughts together in that. Confer with staff about putting that in a public meeting, and then giving you and other stakeholders a chance as well to weigh in.
Thank you.
Okay, Michelle, thank you.
Michelle, this is Scott Arby. I agree with that. And also, I just want to clarify, I thought the problem with the exports not being cut was just a one-time implementation issue and that had been resolved. Is there a continuing problem we need to be aware of?
Sorry, let me unmute her. She remuted herself.
Yeah, so my understanding was from last July events that CAISO cut the exports, but the instructions weren't followed. And this is what I'm trying to get clarity on. So my understanding is that both BAAs have to agree to the cuts. So the thing is that if you don't actually put the ETAG in, then you don't have this issue about whether both sides agree to the cuts. But if you have the ETAG there, then those issues arise. But I don't have insight into this. What I'm pulling from is Guillermo's presentation about what happened last July. But this does concern me that if the ETAGs aren't followed, we have a reliability issue here in California.
Right, I agree with that, Michelle. I think we'll follow up with the CAISO. I thought that issue had been resolved, but maybe if it hasn't been, we definitely ought to talk about it. So,
okay, thank you.
Good.
Okay. All right, Michelle, thank you. Those are two comments that are helpful, and we appreciate those because we're always talking about what agenda items we ought to have on meetings, and this is an important input. Operator, is there anybody else on the phone lines with a comment or question?
No, all phone lines are empty.
Okay, that's great. That's one more comment than we usually get. And again, Michelle, I'm grateful for that. So thank you. Regarding the agenda for today on RA, there's sets of questions that we know that staff, stakeholders are very interested in, and we are interested in also. For example, concerning the proposed move to a UCAP type system and the local RA roles in establishing resource counting requirements. A discussion, it was felt that a discussion about the elements of good design of UCAP might be useful at this time, and we'll be getting into that here, and as well as the ISL's role in that. This will not be the last meeting that we'll hold on general RA issues. So if we don't address it fully this time, we will be getting to it next time in the near future. In addition, there's interest in questions about what other ISOs and RTOs are doing, and how they're accounting for outages when they're developing their reserve margins, counting rules, and availability performance incentives. What's been tried, what's worked, what's not worked so well. As all of us consider the California RAIM system and how it should be modified or what it should be replaced with. So we'll be wanting to talk about those trade-offs. There'll be some of that discussion here, but it's by no means, it's probably not going to be complete at this point. We hope to get a more complete picture of what experience there has been elsewhere and benefit from that. If not today, then at later meetings. And finally, it'll be important to discuss either now or more likely eventually about additional analyses that would be useful of which particular pieces of RA reform. And I anticipate that we'll have more discussions in the future with more detail on that. So to address these questions, we have a couple of presentations, one from ISO staff by Partha to kick things off. And then Jim has organized some questions and comments in the presentation. And Scott and I have also been thinking about this, although we don't have formal presentations, you'll be hearing from all of us on these issues over the next couple of hours. So Partha, I think we're ready to start with your presentation.
Sounds great. Yeah, can you hear me okay? And
yes.
Can I ask, can folks on the phone see the presentation that's being given? I have a separate call-in. I don't have the presentation from, like, as an external participant. So I just was curious. I just want to make sure that people could, if people want to weigh in the chat, if they can't see the presentation, I'd be interested.
Yes, we can see it. We're good.
Okay. Yeah, at least I'd ask, I don't know if, I'd be interested if the attendee wanted to weigh in, because as an attendee, I cannot see the presentation.
Thank you, Partha. I'm having her check. Hang on just a second.
Okay. Yeah, so I've gotten some feedback.
I'm getting private message from attendees that they can see it. If you would like to say that you can or can't see it, please send a message to all panelists and not just the event producer.
Yeah, some people are saying that this webinar will start soon. Others are saying that they can see it. So yeah, we'll plug forward and see it. I was just more, I have a sort of that separate. I call in separately as a participant to have the presentation up on two devices. So, but yeah, we'll move forward, and if there is any, if folks have challenges, maybe they can put that in the chat for those who do.
If I may suggest, if any participants having problem, download the presentation because it is uploaded on the MSC website. And Partha, if you could say what slide number you're on at a particular time so that people can follow their PDF copy if that's how they have to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, well, maybe kicking it off, really, Benjamin, Scott, really thank you for the opportunity to discuss some key topics we're considering as a part of our resource advocacy working group. We're really looking forward to focus and, as you discussed, on needed changes to certain one of our processes to make sure they're working as efficiently and effectively as possible to meet our reliability objectives, while being in harmonization with the CPUC, the CEC, and other local regulatory authority processes. We recognize that there's lots of changes underway in California in the West. California is projected to need, 79 gigawatts of new renewable generation, around 50 gigawatts of battery storage to meet its 2024 greenhouse gas reduction goals. And at the same time, the CPUC is moving to implement a slice of day proposal with new accreditation values based on exceedance methodology for renewables, and considering simultaneously a UCAP proposal as a part of the RA design. So, as a part of this initiative, we're really trying to hone in on changes to our programs and processes to make sure that they're working as efficiently and reliably as possible. To set expectations for this presentation, I recognize the fact that we have 25 slides that we're hoping to complete, and my objective is to complete them in fairly quickly and really to set more time up for a robust discussion with stakeholders around some key topics, particularly related to resource accreditation, as well as performance incentive issues. As you alluded to before, Ben, I think we recognize the fact that this will be an iterative process. We're really in the sort of early stages, and as we develop these solutions, and as we move towards more of the initiative phase, we're going to need to have more analysis informing the problem statements and informing the solutions. But we really wanted to have this be sort of the kickoff. So the purpose of this presentation particularly is really to provide some of that background in terms of that broader context, and then maybe we can get into more of a robust discussion on both alternatives as well as you allude to a sort of additional analysis that might be needed. Be willing to switch to page 2. So you're already on that, the context. Yeah, so in particular, I think as a part of our RA working group process, we really had significant feedback around a few topics in particular that participants were wanting to prioritize. And the first one was really around resource counting, and there was an interest in revisiting UCAP in particular in light of sort of both challenges that we've seen within our program as well as the CPUC scoping as a part of the RA reforms, and that participants are really looking at like how can we partner with and work with the PUC as well as other LRAs in developing a effective design for addressing forced outage rates. But then there's been sort of additional questions, as we've gotten into the UCAP discussion on how might that be used to replace or enhance kind of our current incentive mechanisms. Participants, I think, have, the feedback we've gotten, particularly on our RA resource actually available incentive mechanisms, was that it's not, given the change in the markets, it's really not as effective as we'd hoped in terms of incentivizing availability, particularly during critical hours. And then the last topic we got feedback on is the outage and substitution rules, where there's been some questions in terms of if we went to a UCAP type design, if we, could that allow for a relook at some of our outage and substitution processes, and how might those be interrelated or not? And so I think that's what we're really looking to do, is kind of have that initial dialogue around these topics. We've had really good participation from our stakeholders in the working group process, getting their feedback. I think this will be another chance to get your take and to have a dialogue with stakeholders as well around these topics. So a couple of these slides, I'm going to try to go through these really quickly. They warrant more time, but to really get in this discussion, we have sort of 3 different problem statements in our working group. The first one is related to sort of RA modeling, trying to provide transparent and actionable information on the reliability of the ISO/BA with respect to RA, and how can we provide that information. So the next 2 problem statements are really kind of a sort of framing the relook at our design and sort of the ISO's processes, procedures, tools, and trying to make sure that they are addressing any inefficiencies and any areas that are ineffective. And we've really kind of gotten into sort of a lot of the specifics here, but as a part of the working groups. But for the sake of this discussion, we're really focusing on some of those bold items in terms of making sure that we have, the perception is that currently some of our tools are inefficient in incentivizing, either the right procurement of resources or investment in capital maintenance, capital upgrades and maintenance in order to be reliable. And then there's sort of sub-issues related to the effectiveness
of— Are you going on to the next slide, Partha? Because you're still, I'm still seeing slide 2.
Yeah, I apologize. My computer's not updated.
I got some questions. I mean, fine, I'll discuss it later, but I want to know what we're talking about now. You have a where needed. Yeah. Is there a locational aspect to our problems that the local requirements aren't right and we've got capacity located in the wrong regions?
I think it's an open. It's been one of the open questions that participants have asked, is the particularly around deliverability and whether or not we need to relook at some of those elements. I think that from our standpoint, the when is probably the more important aspect. And that.
Okay, so just on the when then, is the when a reflection of high D rates, that we got high D rates, or is it resources that don't perform or don't offer, or what exactly is the problem that we're dealing with?
Yeah, excellent question. Well, we have some data, as you've seen. I think that when we're looking at it, I think it's really we're probably in the preliminary stage in terms of understanding what the exact problem is around the unavailability. Some of the data we're going to show later will sort of indicate that, particularly during stress conditions, that there were very high forced outage rates, from a variety of different resources, and that they exceeded the planning expectations as well as.
Okay, yeah, we can go to that later. I got questions about that too, but we'll get to that. And then the inefficient procurement and investment. What exactly, you say maintenance and capital upgrades, what exactly is the issue? What things do you see happening other than just forced outage rate? Is there something specific you have in mind about what they're not doing and why we think they're not doing it?
That's it. I don't think we have more information than that in terms of what the process looks like. It kind of ties back to some of our, it ties back a little bit to some of the challenges around the outage substitution processes for maintenance, and that a number of participants have indicated that there might not be enough, that our current substitution rules might be preventing needed maintenance to get done. It's probably an open-ended. And
that's not inefficient procurement and investment. It's our outage substitution rules don't work.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they might be interrelated. I don't know that we really have a root cause in terms of the analysis, in terms of saying what is driving it. What we see are the results, really, where we see these higher forced outage rates. And there's kind of an open question of, like, is part of the issue the fact that our incentive mechanisms and our counting rules don't necessarily provide good incentives to perform that maintenance and perform those capital upgrades. And so there might need to be sort of additional, I think what you might be alluding to is there might need to be sort of additional digging into sort of, is that really a root cause of the problem, or are there other elements that could be driving those outage rates as well?
Yeah, it doesn't seem, you haven't said anything that makes me think it's maintenance and capital upgrades. All you mentioned was outage substitution rules, that they can't do it and they have to declare a forced outage in order to do planned maintenance. So that seems to be pointing directly at the substitution rules and how we handle planned maintenance.
Yeah, and so I was more alluding to that being a related type issue, but I don't think that we have really what we have is the data indicating that, and we do need to do more analysis around this. We have some data indicating that the outage rates were significantly higher, particularly during these stress conditions. And so that's what really.
But if that's all ambient temperature related, it doesn't have anything to do with it. It seems like there's a disconnect, and we need to do some analysis before we know it has anything to do with maintenance or capital upgrades. If it's because we don't take account of, operating rates on hot summer days, then of course we're going to see high D rates, but maintenance and capital upgrades isn't going to change the fact that the units have a poor heat rate when it's really hot. So yeah, anyway, you just understand where I'm coming from. I think we need a lot more understanding what this is about before we can even understand what the problem is.
Yeah. I guess I had read the inefficient procurement and investment line as more that there's over procurement of certain types of resources and under procurement of other types of resources. And that's of course over and under is also sort of a subjective criterion. But you could certainly have a concern that the way the counting rules or other rules are structured, that we're procuring sort of resources that are, I guess. So I had a related question, was just is there a sense, or is the concern here also that the RA rules themselves are sort of leading to inefficient procurement, where inefficiency might be kind of thought of as both, there's the inefficiency with regards to, are they giving the right contribution to reliability, which is sort of what the RA rules are structured to try to guarantee or improve. And then there's also this related question, which is probably not what you meant here, but it's, are RA rules, even if they maybe are capturing reliability contributions correctly, leading to an inefficient portfolio when we consider all of the capabilities, energy, ancillary services, storage, or whatever, If you somehow could do a global optimization of all of those things simultaneously, you could imagine a circumstance where the RA rules are sort of somehow giving inefficiencies with regards to the capabilities in the other things that we want resources to do. And I guess I had that sort of idea in mind when I read this line, but that is probably a little too global for what you were intending here.
Yeah, I don't think I was getting really to the IRP type topics. At least that was my intention as a part of this. It was really more along the lines of when we have a set of resources, and inefficient procurement might be more of like how the contracts are structured, what the incentives look like. And so like, I think if right now we're obviously in a very tight market where everything is needed and we really need everything to perform and to have maintenance. So we're in a little bit today where I think we're in a little bit of a different circumstance. Ideally, I think it would be the case where if you had two resources and let's just say right now, if the price of one resource for capacity is a little bit cheaper than the other resource, but it has a much higher forced outage rate during, extreme events, it might be the case where we don't really have efficient incentives to procure a resource that's more reliable versus one that's slightly less reliable based on sort of the current counting rules and the current availability incentives. And so like that incentive both to procure the right resources in that world where we have excess, as well as that incentive to perform maintenance to be reliable during the key times. I think that's what we're getting at with that bullet is, but we don't really feel like our tools and processes, we think it needs to be re-looked at whether our tools and processes are efficient and effective at getting that maintenance done in particular. And maybe I'll take one step back to part of like what they were doing here is like, these are really our opening problem statements. And so like, at least to your point, Scott, I think part of what we were doing with our working group process and with you all is looking at reshaping them potentially and looking at sort of what data and what analysis might be needed to shape these problem statements in the right direction. So to the degree that your reaction is like, I don't have enough information to say, is this the right problem statement or not? I need to delve deeper. Yeah, I think that's right on in terms of where we're at in the process, because this is really kind of more of the our opening discussion point in terms of how we were seeing the potential implications of our rules and designs and what the effect was on the incentives and the effectiveness of our program. Yeah. So anything else on this slide, or should we jump to the next one real quick?
We can go to slide 4.
I really appreciate the discussion. Why don't we move up over this one just for the sake of time? We switch to slide 5. So this slide, I recognize that we could spend, a day going through the different elements of this slide. And really, all I was really wanting to highlight here was the fact that we recognize that we're discussing a couple key elements. The reason we're wanting to discuss availability performance, which is kind of in the, slightly lower right-hand side, and capacity counting, it really is a part of sort of an entire machine of RA within the California context, and that there are many different entities and processes that all need to sort of fit together to have this design be as efficient and reliable as possible. And so that's part of the reason why we really feel like we need to partner with the CEC, with the CPUC and LRAs to make sure that all these pieces are fitting right, such that, to the degree that we're sort of changing and modifying our counting design rules and working with the different LRAs on that, maybe changing our availability and performance penalties, that sort of the entire machine is sort of working correctly to provide a efficient, reliable, implementable design process for California. We want to switch to slide 6. So thanks. So this is, again, I think this is what you've alluded to before. And we want to take a time to really start the conversation on sort of the key policy, on sort of the all of our RA processes and procedures, and sort of the evolving challenges of the design, given the evolving regulatory mix, the supply and demand balance, and the changes in regulatory structures, within California and outside. And a lot of these topics were discussed sort of at length in the paper. We recognize that we're going to be kind of breaking up a couple of these pieces in particular in discussing kind of the demonstrations and showings processes around the counting that will be associated with the demonstrations and showings, as well as the availability incentive mechanisms. But these other pieces are sort of critical, and that we're going to have continued discussions in the working group on all these related topics to make sure that they're working right. If you're willing to go to slide 7 is basically a placeholder for sure some of the outage data, and that. And slide 8, I think, is where we're going to get into a little bit of the substance, so we can hopefully have a little bit of a more robust conversation around this. And yeah, please feel free to jump in with questions. I have Abhishek and the team here as well. But this is really, we have a number of graphs, and this is, again, a starting point. And so I think that, Scott, to your point, to really you have sort of feedback on the analysis, questions, as well as perspectives on sort of what additional analysis might be needed, really having a discussion on sort of what that analysis might look like, why do you think that's critical. I think that's could really help stakeholders understand sort of how you view the problem statements and how you view this information as particularly affecting both the problem statements as well as potential solution development around these topics. And so this graph in particular really sort of was looking at the system RA outage rates for the summer months from 2021 to 2023. And what you can see, and this is obviously on a daily basis, and what you can see is that like that orange bar there really is kind of the band of what is being planned for in different types of analyses, including the CAISO's 2023 summer assessment, the CEC 2023 summer assessment outlook, stack analysis. But in general, what we're seeing was that we might be planning for 5.5 to 7.5% forest outage rates, but particularly during sort of the key during the summer months as well as some on key days, those outage rates exceeded what we were planning for by a significant margin. And so this is kind of like the first high-level look at like, oh, is there a problem? Maybe it probably more elicited to us sort of saying like we needed to sort of dive more into the details to understand which resources, what was sort of the root cause of those problems, and were there sort of incentives or other issues that sort of led to the outage rates being higher.
Just a question or two about this. For the outages, does this include all planned outages or just planned outages that aren't substituted?
This is Abhishek here. So these are all the outages that would show up for an RA resource. So this would include the planned and the forced outages, which are not substituted. Yeah.
Right. So if it includes planned outages, they could be high in a day because we had low load, and that's when we wanted them to take the outages. I mean, the next slide, which gets to outages on tight summer days, is relevant, but this doesn't really persuade me that this is a problem. This could be consistent with no problem, that they're taking the outages on the days we don't need them. So just a thought.
Can I ask Abhishek, can you clarify that too? So all of our planned outages are as a part of our processes require substitution. So like to me, would this include sort of planned outages that have been substituted as a part of the data? Would those be still showing up as outages in this data set?
No, if they are substituted, they wouldn't show up in this particular data. So if they're already substituted, because the planned outage is a very, very small percentage in this particular data set. It's more of the forced outage that we are concentrating more on this.
Okay, so the planned outages that are replaced are not in this. This is just the planned outages that we couldn't that they did not have substitution on. Is
Yeah.
that right?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, I have a question too, just to make sure I understand the relationship of this to the following slides, whether they're using the same definition. So the outage rates here for September 2022 are a little bit lower than those on the next slide. And I'm wondering if there are two different definitions of outages used on slides 8 and 9, or if there's something else going on. Just
No,
to
these are-
make sure I understand the definitions being used.
Yeah, the definition is pretty much the same. The definition is the same. It's just that these are the average values over the day, and those are the hourly values across each and every hour. That is why it might be a little different.
Okay, so for example, on the next slide, we see that on September 6th, the average outage is over 16%. If you average over the day in September 6th, but there's nothing shown as being over 16% on the previous slide.
Okay, we can go back and we can see, but the definition of the outage rates are the same across the slides, and we can look into it and provide we can deep dive into that hour and see what might be going on.
Okay,
But the
they're
definition is the same across
they're
the
intended to
Well,
they're
the
intended to be the
definition can't
same.
be the same if the numbers are different. There's got to be something wrong. You know, it's either a different definition or the data's not right.
They're intended to be the same, it sounds like, but there may
Yeah.
be a discrepancy for some reason, and you're going to check into that, I guess.
Yeah, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The important thing for me was that they were intended to be the same. It's not two. You didn't mean two very different definitions. And thanks.
And thanks, Ben, for moving us forward. I think that as you allude to, I think you understand what's in the data for this slide, but we need to take back and look at it. But really, it's showing, you know, particularly, and I think that we'll get into a little bit on sort of how much of it was ambient versus how much was associated with what I call a traditional forced outage rate. But there was significantly, you know, if we look at this is the percentage of the total showings. And so, like, at least for the gas fleet, you know, it was, you know, a fairly high percentage. So, like, that would, you know, when we're looking at sort of just gas, it might be, you know, close to 20% in terms of what that outage rate looks like just for that portion of the fleet. But almost all resources.
You know, Abhishek, I'm trying to understand that, because if you look at the DMM data in table 8.5 of their report, when they're looking at the EAA watch plus hours, that they've got gas at 93%, you know, when the day had market and 90 to 93. So what is this, why is this unique to September, that it was much, much higher than other EA watch hours, or is there something else being done here?
Just wanted to reiterate. So when you say that the 93% is the outage rate, or I'm just trying to understand.
No, the 93% available. So 7% is the outage rate, and then you're saying it's. I mean, we don't really have the percentage of the gas fleet here. We got it as a percentage of all generations. So maybe, you know, but if you're saying it was 20%, that seems a lot higher than what the DMM data was showing.
But then this is.
I wonder if
But
there's
then this. Yeah, but then this is comparing against the RA showing. So if a particular resource, which is 500 megawatts resource fleet, has a 250 megawatts of RA showing, we would be comparing against the 250 megawatts of RA showing instead of the generation fleet of 500 megawatts.
Right. I mean, this really doesn't show the gas ratio. It only shows as a percent of all RA capacity, but you just said that that the actual rate for gas was 20%, which seems a lot higher than what's in the DMM data. So I'm just trying to understand what the difference was. Was it 3 times higher than even during EEA watch conditions on September and all these days, or is there something?
Yeah. So from the data, it shows that the gas fleet is around it's around 9 to 10%.
Okay, so not 20%, 8%.
No.
Okay.
No. It's about 9 to 10% is what we have seen during these high condition days, high stress days.
Okay, that's
For
good. I
the
mean, it'd be better if this table were, instead of showing everything, and we have to figure out what the ratio is for gas to show it, and
Okay.
same on the next
Will do.
table. It doesn't really show what the rate is for gas, or the outage rate for batteries, or the outage rate for anything in particular, which makes it hard to see what the problem is. Okay,
Yeah.
and this doesn't include units that didn't respond to dispatch, right? It's just outages. If we had
These are just
batteries that
outages.
weren't available because of state of charge, they're not included as a problem here, right?
Yes, absolutely. These are just what they have provided as an outage card, where they've actually mentioned that they are on outage. Yes. But then if you go to the next slide, Partha, I think that's where it shows, at least for the September, it was the gas outage rate, the gas fleet outage rate was about 8%, which is similar to what DMM is also mentioning. For the September 2022, the gas fleet is about 8% is what, at least from the monthly average that we've seen.
Yeah. Actually, would you mind going back 2 slides right now? And at least like what we're doing here is like at least when you're, I think what you might be alluding to, Scott, and like Abhishek, please correct me, is the fact that like, so the events we're really narrowing in on are those sort of that super peak right in the middle of this in terms of the outage rates on the daily basis. And so like those were the days where we were basically having, that was the extreme heat wave where we had loads above 50,000 megawatts for those extreme days. And we saw outage rates that look like significantly higher than the surrounding days. And so what we're really doing in that next slide to me was sort of zooming in on that sort of those peak days. And there's probably some question of like, was this an anomaly? Is there some sort of correlation? We don't have, obviously, we don't have a lot of those extreme events to take from in terms of the load getting to that level and extreme heat that went along with it. But that's sort of what was led to sort of us wanting to take a look at those extreme days where we were having, we were near load shedding conditions. We were at like having emergency events, and so that's where I think that was really sort of poking into those days in particular. Is that helpful context, Scott, or anything else you want to correct?
Looking at these days, it's just a matter, we want to understand what's in there. And since it doesn't actually show the percentage on these days of what's the outage rate for gas, what's the outage rate for batteries, that's why I was trying to probe which actual types of units had the high outage rates given the amount of shown capacity.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. I think that great feedback. We can take it back. I just more wanted to highlight that there is certainly a difference between the monthly averages. So you might see the events that might be when we take in all the EA events versus looking at just that subset of very high load days. So.
Right. Do you understand why the outage rate is the highest in the middle of the night? It seems like the hours from 1 to 5 or 6 have the highest outage rate.
Can you show me?
On your graphic 9s, go to the graphic you were on.
Go to the next slide.
Next slide.
Yeah, and it's gas units that are doing it. So 2 a.m. on September 6th.
Yeah, so they have these, there are these types of resources. I don't know the specifics. I've looked at it in the past, but I think they have an outage for the first 6 hours of the day. And I don't know the specific term what they use for these outages, but they have these specific outages where they just out for the first 6 and then they're available for the rest of the day.
Maybe is this noise limits or something like that they can't run at night? Okay, I'm just curious to make sure we understand what's in this data and what we're.
I can take it. I can look into that and I can provide. We have looked at it in the past, and I think I can provide a response to that.
Interesting. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Well, why don't we, for the sake of time, why don't we flip ahead to 2 more slides? I think we have why don't we go 1 more for now? This is one I think I really wanted to point this out. I think we've discussed this previously, but this is really, I think, we probably need to do sort of additional analysis around like how much of this is really just due to ambient D rates that are not being accounted for versus other factors. But this is really kind of a graph that's really trying to describe sort of the relationship between the ambient D rates and peak load. And so the orange graph basically describes is sort of sorting the data by the peak load level. And then the sort of the information below in blue is really the outage rates for those different load levels. And it's hard to see the correlation, but when we sort of dug into it further, it looked like there's sort of roughly a 4% ambient D rate during the higher, more extreme conditions, when load was above 45,000 megawatts. And, during most of the other periods, it looked like the outage rate was, at 2% or less. So some percentage of this is associated with the ambient D rates. And that, one of the things that we've identified when we've sort of probed a little more into the data, when we looked at sort of past years, there was that there was some change in different periods where, what it looked like, I think we were assuming that generators were shaping their NQC values for different seasons based on ambient D rates, and part of the reason might have been to avoid rain exposure and rain penalties. And that we've seen when we looked at the data, and we can provide that in a future meeting, sort of a more robust look at this, and look at there's sort of less shaping going on. There's fewer people, and a lot of parties. Our assumption was we're just showing the full max capacity of the resource rather than reflecting likely ambient D rates by season. And so that was at least another thing where we looked at, like, to your point, how much of the problem was that versus how much was sort of what I call traditional forced outage rates. That was sort of at least one topic we thought was sort of worth discussing in terms of the program design of, how much of this can we take on directly by sort of testing in different seasons versus sort of accounting for as a part of the UCAP methodology or some sort of other calculation or some other incentive mechanism to address the issue. So.
Sorry, Partha, I just want to make sure I heard correctly. So you said that they were shaping in the past in anticipation of D rates, and that practice has kind of lightened up as perhaps the RAIM incentive has become less strong relative to the value, or is that what you were implying, or?
That's my hypothesis. I don't know that we've fully worked it out and worked through stakeholders, but the relative value of RA, when we look at sort of where RA is trading for and what the prices of RA versus the consequences associated with having some sort of penalty potentially assessed as a part of a RAIN structure, it was, it's now, pennies on the dollar compared to what, RA is trading for in terms of what the consequences look like. And so there's probably a question that we have in terms of, like, it might have been working reasonably effective in the past because it was having some sort of exposure to RAIM. But, we've heard from some, I think I just saw Peter weigh in. We've heard some suppliers say that they are shaping it. We've seen sort of a change in those practices. And so that's sort of one thing that we thought we needed to dive into more.
Right. No, it seems like this is a testable. So for units that have been around for a while, are we seeing different kinds of levels of NQC being offered? So that would be interesting to know.
Yeah, I see that Peter Griffiths weighed in sort of the exact same statements, saying some do shape the NQCs for ambient D rates, but sort of acknowledging that the RA prices and incentives are sort of what might be driving this. So, feel free, by the way, if you want to weigh in, Peter, or raise your hand, feel free to as well.
Yeah, I agree. We should be, I think the counting rules should take account of the ambient temperature D-rate. It's something that's predictable on the hot summer days, and it's gonna be correlated across units. So, you know, it's not like a random outage factor. It's gonna, all your units are gonna be derated on the same day. So, and you know, it's not an undoable thing. The NISO has been doing it since 1999, and the New York Power Pool was doing it in the early 90s. So it is not a heavy lift to take account of ambient D rates and setting your summer capacity requirements. So, I mean, that seems to be a good thing to do in the counting rules. So we see much, you know, how much of real maintenance problem we got as opposed to, you know, it gets hot sometimes.
Right. I have a stupid engineering question. So when I understand that output is hampered on hotter temperatures. Is that a daily average temperature sort of effect though, or is it even more tightly correlated to say hours? So to the extent we have, for example, our tight conditions after sunset when it may not be, although it's still pretty hot in California, I guess even at 8 p.m. I'm just wondering, is that, you know, less of an issue after the sunsets, for example, than during the very hottest hours of the day, or is it more of a daily average thing? Does anyone know?
I'm not an engineer, but I think it's at the time of the year running. But you know, that's something we should nail down.
So Carnot efficiency, it depends on the cooling water source, if there's cooling water. And so that's more damped over, that's not going to vary a lot over the day or at all. But if it's air cooled, you've got forced air, evaporative cooling towers, then it's definitely the ambient air temperature at the time, the wet bulb temperature. I don't know how much dry cooling there is. There's some in California, in which case it's the dry bulb temperature at the time that you're doing it. So it depends on the facility and how they're cooled.
Right. And so in practice, when ISOs do ambient temperature D rates, how precise, or is that more of a seasonal thing, or is it something that gets triggered? I guess this is more of a planning tool. So you don't know a specific day. You're just sort of saying, we know in the future we're going to have a hot day. That'll be a problem. And we also know plants are bad on those circumstances. So
right. Yeah. We can take account of what you said, Jim. If we see, the really bad hours are, 8 o'clock, then we can, use the ambient temperature, at that time, and not derate as much as at 3 in the afternoon. And conversely, you can give higher ratings in the winter if our typical day is cold, if our high stress day is cold.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a lot of questions about how much this is like a master file parameter issue, where like it might be sort of on a more granular basis. You want to have different values for different hours, versus sort of when we look at that more forward planning and showing process. How should we look at it when obviously they can perform at different values and different hours? My understanding from some of our outreach with some of the other markets, ISO and PJM, they do testing. They do testing for key summer months. It doesn't sound like that they necessarily did the single most extreme days in terms of like testing what the performance might, or what the ambient D rate might look like. But there was certainly a difference between the seasons, and certainly a testing of what would be a reasonably hot summer day in terms of what the unit could perform like in those conditions. So yeah,
that's a good point, Bart. With a monthly system, we could have monthly values for the capacity, and in real time, of course, we want to use the right numbers there. Otherwise, the operators think they're getting 100 megawatts, and you get 90.
Yep. Yep. Well, thanks for that. Maybe we can move on to the next slides. Yeah, so I think this slide, and Abhishek can maybe talk to a little more. This is really getting at the sort of what you kind of alluded to before, like how much of it is an ambient D rate issue for thermal resources as opposed to forced outage rates. And this is sort of obviously a lot of data for a lot of different days. But what it really shows that on some days, the ambient D rates are a very high percentage of the total forced outage rates, while on other days it's a fairly small percentage of the total forced outage rate. So it probably warranted more of a deep dive into sort of certain days and certain conditions and what the correlations look like between those two. But this is kind of an initial start of your question, Scott, on sort of how much is ambient versus how much is not ambient in terms of the problems that we're trying to solve.
Yeah, this is very helpful.
We want to move to the next slide. So I thought we'd go through sort of fairly quickly. I think we can have like a little bit of discussion kind of on our current resource adequacy, availability, incentive mechanism design, but then move to sort of like more of a discussion of kind of UCAP as well as sort of what other markets are doing on these topics. So if we wanted to move to sort of one more slide. I'll cover these really quickly, but this is what we're alluding to before, and this is really kind of describing sort of what's the changes in market dynamics. So what we have here is really the 16-hour hub price in the West, and this is really looking at for May of that year what the price looked like at the different hubs going forward. And that really what we saw was that like from 20 if we looked at sort of before 2018, 2020, it was fairly low, relatively speaking. Like those were fairly stable in terms of the values, and that there was basically a very sharp uptick. And that like I intentionally didn't include the bilateral traded capacity prices. There's a bunch of data that's been provided. There's some information by the CPUC in their RA reports in terms of different percentiles where RA is contracted for. The CCAs had a report out indicating some of those hub data. But this was for sort of this was sort of the public data that we saw that we could look at to say, the prices have risen significantly. The implied capacity prices, sort of subtracting out energy revenues, have gone up significantly. But our CPM soft offer cap, we have an adjustment that has been approved by the board. We'll go by FERC. It'll raise it by a little by a small percentage, but it is now sort of very much not in line with what bilateral prices are trading for. And particularly this has an effect on our RAIM calculation, which is RAIM is really set at a percentage of 60% of the CPM soft offer cap. And so it really is the case that right now we're not, that the RAIM and the incentives provided via RAIM are significantly less than the bilateral trading. And this is kind of what we've alluded to before of like, there's kind of an increased mismatch between the bilateral market prices, what RA is trading for, and what the penalties look like for unavailability in the market. So if we wanted to go to
Arthur, before you go on, could you just walk us through quickly how you would back out the capacity prices and how big these would imply? It doesn't seem straightforward to me. You'd be looking at times that the price hits the cap and then somehow shape. Anyway, tell me how you do that and how you conclude that they really are significantly above the soft offer cap.
Sure. And I would, to do it justice, maybe I can circle back on it. I think the idea is that there are also indexing prices for energy. And like if we look at sort of what the SP15 and MP15 prices are within the value, there's basically kind of an energy component to it. And so I think that, I probably, for the sake of this call, probably wouldn't do the math on the fly, if that's all right. But I think we can sort of.
Okay, so there is a procedure, and just how much higher do you think the implied prices here are relative to the 6.31?
Maybe I can talk about it in terms of sort of like we've heard, and part of other reports is information indicating that the prices might be, often there are monthly prices. Some of them we've heard for annual basis, but they've been, on the monthly prices, which is obviously not really apples to oranges. It's a little bit apples to oranges, but they'll be we've heard prices of sort of north of $50 a kilowatt month, and some people indicated significantly higher than $50 a kilowatt month for those prices. So, yeah, and that's sort of all part of the reports that they produced.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that's more informative than just this graph by itself. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, part of the reason is
those prices, the $50 a kilowatt month, that's a capacity price or energy price, or I'm still not, Ben's questions were good, and I'm confused about what these numbers are, because, if it's just an energy price, you have to back out the cost of fuel and everything, and if the marginal resource is gas, and this is driven by high gas prices, this is, I mean, this also coincides with the huge gas price spike. So I just wonder if this is, not a capacity price spike, but an energy price spike due to gas prices.
Yeah, some of this could be the energy price spike. When I'm talking about the capacity numbers, I'm talking about that dollars per kilowatt capacity charge, and that there's various data out there by the PUC and the CCAs, and they're all sort of and I allowed them to weigh in. Part of the reason
it'll be good together if you've got that data. It'd be good for the CAISO to formulate gather that CPUC data and put it into the discussion, because I think that's more meaningful than looking at these energy prices.
Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, fundamentally, you can sell energy and capacity, and so and energy price isn't necessarily. That's what Ben was sort of getting at. I think you have to somehow convert this into. And I guess I had a question also just about RAP. Do we know anything? I've actually know little about it, but there are transactions happening even now. Is that correct? And do we know anything about those kinds of prices? Are they as equally opaque as California's RA market?
For me, they're equally as opaque, and I think it's obviously like what we really. I've been really conscious about not wanting to provide here's the ISO's estimate of what prices look like, because I think a lot of it's hearsay, and a lot of it could be sort of subject to, and there's a lot of sensitivities in terms of that data and what's going on in key months. And so if other folks on the call wanted to weigh in on those bilateral prices and what they're hearing in the market, I certainly welcome folks who are doing the transactions to sort of weigh in on sort of those price levels. I would say that, like, anecdotally, like what we've heard is that the market throughout the West is very tight, and the prices throughout the West are trading at very high levels, and that the requirements under the RAP program are high, and that participants are also trying to meet those requirements simultaneously. So I think part of what you might be getting at is we are participating, and we always have been in a West-wide market. Now we have a specific RAP program that many participants are joining, with forward requirements and forward showing requirements associated with their program design, which also might be having an impact on the ability to contract and the ability to procure in the markets. And so, but yeah, I think that the tightness is, I think, felt West-wide. I think this probably can be sort of broadly agreed upon.
So I notice in the chat, and I don't monitor the chat usually, so but I do see that Lauren Carr from Cal CCA can speak to their data on capacity prices. So this might be a good time, operator, if you could turn to the phone lines.
Hi, this is Lauren Carr from Cal CCA. Can you hear me okay?
Perfectly. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so Partha alluded to some data that Cal CCA has provided, and we did a little bit of a different analysis using the FERC electronic quarterly reports, and that's all public data. And the reports show from the analysis that we've done that the weighted average capacity price in kilowatts per month has more than tripled between 2019 and 2023. More than 11,000 megawatts of RA was purchased at prices above the proposed CPM soft offer cap. And the highest prices that we observed in that data rose from $29 per kilowatt month in September 2020 to over $60 per kilowatt month in September of 2023. Also, the CPUC has an RA market price benchmark that kind of represents the average value of RA, and that's rose to $15 per kilowatt month. So that's some of the data that we've collected. This week, actually, it's kind of a coincidence that we're talking about this now, but RTO Insider published an article about the prices in ISO New England, saying that their capacity auction price rose $1 this year to $3.58 per kilowatt month, which kind of gave us pause because the last time we saw the weighted average prices in that range in California was back in 2019. And obviously they've continued to go up dramatically since then. So thanks for letting me speak on these issues. And I just wanted to flag that RA prices are something that we'd be interested in hearing the MSC's thoughts on, if they've looked into them at all, or into the competitiveness of the RA market in California under the current supply and demand balance. And I'd be happy to talk more about it, but that's something that we'd be really interested in hearing your perspective on, if you have any now or in the future.
So, Lauren, thank you for providing that information. I'd be very if you wouldn't mind communicating with us, and I guess it can be done offline. The FERC and CPUC sources, and if they are, if their procedures for calculation them are transparent and replicable, that would be very helpful to us.
Yeah, we'd be happy to share that. So I'll reach out to you.
So whatever you gave the CPUC with all this, tabulated, so that we could look at it, that would be very helpful. If you can give us the link or wherever it is. Thank you.
Will do. We have a white paper on it, so I'll reach out to you.
Great.
Oh, that's terrific.
Thanks.
Let's see, anybody else want to make a comment on the phone lines right now? I see Peter Griffiths has added some comments online, and Chris Devon. Operator, anybody queued up? If not,
There's currently no one in queue to ask questions.
okay. Thanks for checking. Okay. Let's carry on. Partha, I was the one who stopped you at the end of this slide, so give you permission to go to the next one.
Yeah, we'll try to get through these quickly, because I think that more of the substance will be taking place during the UCAP discussions and some of our future slides. But this is kind of looking for more the background on kind of the RAIN and penalty mechanisms that we have or incentive and penalty mechanisms we have today via RAIN. And that, it's really seen as like, the RAIN design works for basically on a monthly average by resource. And so if the average for a resource for performance for the applicable product falls below 94.5%, the resource is subject to a penalty. And if the average is above 98.5%, the resource is eligible for a payment from the pool of penalty revenues assessed. And so the dollar value is fairly low, and I think that there's kind of this is really done on a monthly basis in terms of what the assessment looks like. So if we're looking at sort of those issues before, it might be the case where a resource could have had ambient D-rate during those key periods, but on a monthly average basis could have been still either falling in the availability band or actually available for eligibility payment, even though that they were having a forced outage via an ambient D-rate during those critical hours.
Sorry. Go ahead, finish up. I'm trying to remember, is this, are these availability metrics focused on a subset of hours, or are they a 24/7 metric?
For system, it's the RAIN availability hours.
Yeah,
okay. So there's a subset of the hours. Yeah.
Yeah. And is there any distinction between undeclared outages and a failure to bid. I guess with bid substitution, there may not be a lot of the latter anyways.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Can you restate that? I'm not quite following.
Oh, I'm just trying to think about whether there's any, later on, I'm going to try to get into the distinction between market participation and physical availability. And I'm trying to remember sort of whether there's any distinction here. So for example, a plant that doesn't tell the ISO it has an outage, or it's just like, you know, it's derated, it's actually physically derated, but had sold more. And how is that kind of communicated? Is it communicated as, oh, we're on partial outage right now? Or do they just bid a capacity number that's below what their RA number is into the, say, day ahead market?
Yeah. Yeah, we can. I'm not positive about that nuance. I can have that as a follow-up unless somebody else wants to.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess we're going to talk about maybe there's a lot of ways we could probably make RAIN better, and so I don't know if we should focus too much on how they do it. But just curious about that. Okay.
Right, and we can get through, and maybe we want to flip to the next slide. I might go to slide 16. Yeah, this is really like, you know, really at the high level. I think this is like some of the discussion we'll get into a little later, is that, you know, we looked at the impact, you know, the total non-availability charge for timber roughly, result in roughly charges of $3.5 million. And like, you know, in terms of what the total percentages is, we could do sort of a calculation, but it's a fairly small value compared to the capacity payments as a whole. And so that sort of led us to think of like, what do the incentives look like for showing, is this really working effectively to get performance during those peak times? And one of the things we're going to discuss a little later is sort of like a comparison to ISO New England and PJM, which has, you know, paper performance mechanisms, but they also would have sort of, you know, it's a similar mechanism where, you know, units, it's basically a self-funding mechanism between suppliers where units that are performing better than their capacity value compensate ones that are performing worse than their capacity value, but with much higher dollar figures in terms of what the impacts would look like in incentive structures. So I think that this is more sort of setting up that conversation. So if you're willing to flip to the next slide. And we've covered most of this, so maybe we can jump to right now, like some of the PRM discussions.
So
and
could you, I have a question about, you know, you've got the issues about excluded from RAIN, and you know, DMM has some data about that, and they show basically the same D rate between non-RAIN exempt and RAIN exempt, but the big difference is not in the D rates, but in the amount of bids and self-schedules. So, so is it, you know, I'm wondering what the, you know, that doesn't seem like there's a problem in D rates on these units. Maybe it's because these units have different characteristics. Are these all wind and solar, so they're D-rated, they're not self-scheduling because there's no wind or solar, or is it actually a D-rating? And what's this? I mean, I think before we say that this is part of the problem, we need to explain why it is the problem and what the problem is.
Yeah, I think we describe it sort of questioning the effectiveness of the RAIN design, and there's a fairly extensive list of resources that are sort of exempt from, exempt from RAIN. Solar and wind are certainly a major portion of them, but there's certain ambient D rates that are excluded from the calculations. CHP, small DR resources. And so there's a number of different units with different characteristics. And so I think there's probably more of the sort of the acknowledgement, the fact that there was sort of really a subset of resources that were sort of applying RAIN to, but there's also a large percentage that are not. But Can I ask, I'm not from, I don't recall offhand that being, and which report was that from?
That's
I
their
can maybe
annual
take
report, and it's table 8.7. And this is
Okay.
during the EA watch hours. So, just in terms of if this is something we got to understand and is part of the problem, we ought to understand what the problem is.
Thanks for citing that.
Yep.
I know Amelia might know, we're having worked on that report off the top of her, sort of the references to it. I'm not as familiar, but I can follow up with that. So thanks for.
I understand, but just the general point is, we ought to be more specific about what the exclusion problem is. Is it certain people that are excluded that have poor performance, or is there not poor performance?
Yeah, good feedback. Yes, if you want to move to the next slide. On slide 18. And for the planning reserve margin and UCAP, I'm going to turn it over to Anya to lead us through that discussion. We'll circle back to some of our outreach to some of the other markets in terms of practices. But yeah, Anya, please take it away.
That's great. Thanks, Partha. And as Partha mentioned, I'll be talking about some of the background on the current planning reserve margin, default planning reserve margin that the CAISO has in our tariff, as well as our former UCAP proposal. Next slide. So let's get into the current planning reserve margin. Today, each LRA sets their own planning reserve margin and counting rules. It's only if an LRA doesn't provide a PRM or have a counting rule methodology that the CAISO's default tariff rules apply. So again, while we have this default, we do not have either a minimum PRM or prescribed counting rules outside of our defaults. Our current default is 15% above forecasted monthly peak demand, and this was put in place in 2006. So with a much different generation, load, and regulatory paradigm. And as you're well aware, there's an interplay between the planning reserve margin and counting rules. And I'll note the CPUC is a good example of an LRA that's been updating their counting rules, which in their IRP highlights the need for a PRM which is higher than exists today. And they're looking to find the right PRM in light of slice of day and reconciling different counting methodologies. So while exceedance is used in slice of day, ELCC is used in IRP. So when we look at our current LRAs in our footprint, most are setting a PRM at 15%, while some are setting lower planning reserve margins. And I'll note that it's not really possible to determine if those LRAs with a lower PRM really impair our system without comparing the counting rules or attributes of the underlying resources in their portfolios relative to resources or attributes in other portfolios. And an issue that we've highlighted both in the working group and that we want to highlight here is that our default PRM warrants revisiting in light of changes in the RA landscape since it was last updated in 2006. Next slide. All right, well, let's get into UCAP now. Next slide. Great, thank you. So we're coming and talking about counting rules and the UCAP prior proposal in light of the CPUC scoping UCAP into their proceeding and PG&E including the ISO's past UCAP proposal into that proceeding. We're also having discussions around counting rules as part of the problem statements in the RA working group and have been asked by working group participants to kind of dust off the prior UCAP proposal and discuss it in the working group, and wanted to bring it forward here as well to just give that refresher. So I wanted to talk at a high level about some of the attributes of the prior UCAP design. It was resource specific, and the base methodology that was developed was really designed for thermal and storage resources. There were proposals in place for other resource types, and those warranted kind of further conversation. But again, the base methodology was for thermal and storage with some adaptations for other resource types. And it looked at accounting for non-availability by looking at the availability of resources during the top 20% of RA supply cushion hours on a weighted basis, looking at the past 3 years, and looking at this from a seasonal perspective and looking at peak and non-peak hours. I'll note that as part of this proposal, the ISO did recognize the need to eliminate RAIM once an alternative solution was in place. So it wasn't necessarily no performance incentives, but rather recognition that RAIM today would need to be adapted into some other form. It also recognized the interplay with the planning reserve margin and recognized that the PRM could be adjusted to only cover operating reserves and forecast hour to the extent that the resource counting sufficiently accounted for forced outages. And I'll note, just for context, when the ISO looked at this in 2021 and kind of ran some examples of what would this do to the existing gas fleet as an example, we found that the peak months availability was about 91% under UCAP, which translated to about a 2,600 megawatt D rate, and looked like it was about 93% available for off-peak months, translating to about a 2,100 megawatt D rate for a gas fleet that was about 30,000 megawatts. We haven't rerun this analysis. Maybe I'll just also note that when the ISO had this proposal in place previously, one of the more contentious aspects, and this is kind of predates my time at the ISO, was related to some of the sensitivities around the supply cushion. And the supply cushion, which we've highlighted here, was recommended at 20%, was really looking at how much shown RA megawatts are left over after taking into account outages, serving net demand, and covering contingency reserves. The 20% was really modeled off of RAIM at the time. So the fact that RAIM looks at 5 hours today, which is roughly 20% of all hours, but the supply cushion itself was examined in that the benefits were thought that you could penalize resources for being on forced outage when the grid needed them, and it could incentivize resources to be there because the assessment hours could fall at any point in the day. Unlike RAIM today, where the resource knows kind of the hours up front, under this UCAP design, the hours would be set retrospectively, which is an incentive to be there at all times. It was also felt that it could provide a more predictable risk of any one outage on a resource's capacity value, rather than simply having a cutoff at a certain threshold. And it could provide a big enough sample size to be statistically significant and provide observations for a majority of the day. So that was some of the more controversial element, was around what the supply cushion was set at. Let's move to the next slide.
Just one clarifying question. You said available at all times, but it would be offered at all times, right? If it was a long start unit, it wouldn't be penalized because it wouldn't be counted as a D rate because it wasn't online in that hour, right?
That's correct.
Okay.
All right, and let's move to the next slide. Thank you. So we also wanted to touch on the ISO's past rationale for UCAP. So again, at the time, there was a different RA supply and regulatory paradigm from today, but the thinking at the time was that UCAP could promote the procurement of the most dependable and reliable resources up front by accounting for that historical unavailability in their capacity value. We recognize the procurement landscape is different today with a even tighter RA market. And I'll note that the past concern that the current PRM, current forced outage rate and substitution rules and RAIM are inadequate still persists today. And the second reason the ISO was interested in this proposal was that, as opposed to the PRM today that is set by the LRAs, which has generally been a static value, dynamic, the UCAP value would dynamically change with the fleet's forced outage rate over time. That doesn't mean that LRAs couldn't adapt and change that PRM. It was just recognized that it could be a more flexible means of accounting for forced outage rates. And again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, kind of the thinking of UCAP's interaction with the planning reserve margin was that the PRM could be adjusted to account for these forced outages and might only need to cover the operating reserves and forecast error to the extent that UCAP or other resource counting methods accounted for forced outages. So hopefully that was a background there, and I can turn things back over to Partha to talk about.
Just one observation that
Yes.
the California is pretty much unique as far as I know in that the PRM doesn't include a margin to cover planning reserves. So I mean we're staying in that mode here, but I mean I think it's something we ought to consider when we got the issues with availability of supply to cover planned outages, that maybe we ought to include in the planning reserve margin, given the outage requirements of different resources, explicitly include a margin to cover planned outages. Just a thought to as we get into that.
Thank you, Scott. All right, I'll turn things back over to you, Partha.
Yeah, thanks.
I'd like to make a quick comment on PRM and accounting methods and the relationship between counting methods and the PRM that would be required to achieve a certain, whether it's loss of load expectation or whatever probabilistic metric you want, is pretty complicated. It depends on the size of the system, the size of generators that might be an outage. So a system with a few large generators will need more of a PRM than a system with fewer, even with the same forced outage, for example. And I see that Peter Griffiths has made a comment in the chat about the complexity of these interdependencies. So there's definitely not a simple rule that just says that if we derate by an E4D, expected forced outage rate from GADS or something, that then we just need to have a reserve margin that accounts for operating reserve needs. One simple example is variation in year-to-year load profiles due to temperature, and so if there's a lot of temperature caused variability in year-to-year peaks, then to maintain a particular loss of load expectation, you're going to need a higher PRM, and that's independent forced outage rates. Before we go on, let me just check to see if there are any comments on the phone lines. I know, Peter, you've been typing. If you don't have laryngitis, it'd be great to hear from you as well. And anybody else who wants to make a comment. Operator, can you check to see if there's anybody in the phone lines?
There is one person, Chris Devon. You have now been unmuted.
Hi, Chris. It's always good to hear from you. We miss you at these meetings, of course.
Well, thanks, Ben, and the rest of the MSC. I'm glad that we're talking about this stuff with you guys. It's long overdue, so I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the chance to chat a little bit about this. I just wanted to put in a little bit of background on some of the UCAP design stuff. I was working on some of that when I was at CAISO, and just comment on the fact that, I think it is good that we're talking about that prior proposal again, but I would just want to, suggest maybe that MSC opine on kind of how some of those other regions use E4D based UCAP methodologies as opposed to the CAISO's, which I would kind of characterize as an approximation methodology for when units are in demand. And I think that in that sense, they both try to get at the same outcome, which I think Anya described pretty well, as far as trying to incentivize that they're available as much as possible, and focusing on the time and needs. But when you look at the E4D approach that's done in those other regions, it's actually more focused on the specific time of when those exact individual units are in demand and when they're on outage and can't provide energy to the system to meet their capacity contributions that they've been secured to provide. So that point, I think, is something that we debated a lot about, and one of the things that I think we decided was maybe a data intensive issue, and the way that we, I think, tried to look at the idea of this top hours and focusing on the unavailability during those hours was related to some things that I think Alberta had done similarly, which was some kind of an approximation methodology. So if it was just up to me to redesign this proposal, I would say we should try to focus on more of an E4D approach, like what the other regions do. So that's one comment. And then the other one I just wanted to plug in here is I totally agree with the MSC about this thermal issue. I mean, the UCAP derating thing for ambient force to the temperature, that piece doesn't necessarily need to be in the UCAP thing, but it just in general for the capacity ratings, it just makes sense that part be done quickly. I think it's pretty straightforward. So those are my thoughts. I'll leave it at that. Thank you guys for the opportunity.
Thanks, Chris. Appreciate your input and the suggestions. Operator, anybody else on the line?
I also wanted to jump in. I agree with your comments about that, that this is much more complex in assessing the PRM margin than just using the UCAP, and that the UCAP values would plug into a loss of load model and a MARS model or something like that to simulate the probabilistic amount of capacity you need, given, as you said, load forecast uncertainty, outage uncertainty, and it's just an input, but it's a counting rule. But then you still have to determine your PRM margin through that kind of more complicated analysis, as you said, Ben. I totally agree with that.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. Operators, there anybody else?
Yes, there's one Peter Griffs on the phone line.
Oh, good. I'm glad he doesn't have laryngitis. Peter.
Peter, you are now unmuted.
Well, maybe he does have laryngitis.
I see him as not unmuted at this moment, but
He muted himself again.
I'm sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Perfectly.
Yeah, no, Ben, you're absolutely right that that there's a lot of things that go into sort of what sort of the reliability of the system and what determines the reliability of the system. For the most part, the PRM is just really a shortcut rule of thumb type of thing that seems to have worked for a lot of different systems that have a relatively consistent set of resources and relatively consistent load. But for the most part, and that's one of the reasons we need to be careful to some degree about sort of what the expectations are about how things should play out when you start changing the counting rules. Because the counting rules for the most part are going to be deterministic of what the number is for the PRM, but it's not necessarily going to be deterministic of sort of the level of reliability that the system is going to have. And that's really going to be dependent upon the resources that are actually in the system and available to the system. And that's one of the things I wanted to point out. The other thing too is that the discussion at the PUC, and that hasn't been sort of brought into this discussion yet, is that the PUC has a UCAP proposal that they have put on the table for adoption by their, by them, essentially by the commission, essentially as the LRA. The one thing that does do that I think is something that is important to this discussion is it separates out the ambient D rate from essentially the forced outage rate, and essentially is trying to treat them separately in determining that. And that, from my perspective, is one of the issues that I think is that the ISO could probably address, is looking at sort of how to handle the ambient D rate as a separate way that would be applicable essentially to all of its LRAs and not just to LRAs that choose to adopt that. So, you know, I'm glad we're having this discussion. I'm glad we're sort of separating out to some degree some of the ambient D-rate questions about some of the way things should be counted in terms of UCAP. I don't think the PUC is going to be adopting UCAP quickly, even though there is a proposal. I think the proposal on the table, and I'm glad that we sort of have resurfaced the whole discussion at the ISO as well. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Peter. Appreciate yours and everybody's inputs. Let's see, before I hand it back to Partha or Anya, Scott or Jim, you want to say anything? Okay. Okay. Thanks. And if operator, there's nobody else on the phone, I'll hand it back to Partha and Anya.
All lines are empty.
Sounds great. Yeah, I think Peter sort of segmented nicely. There's obviously a number of different ways that sort of us developing a UCAP proposal could be impactful. That certainly part of it is alignment with the PUC. You know, as Anya alluded to before, you know, under our design and framework, the LRAs are, you know, set the PRMs. They have, you know, we have a default, but we don't have a minimum, and so like allowing sort of us to partner with them and provide sort of accurate unit-specific data and a calculation could really sort of be able to sort of partner with their program and allow them to agree that they're setting PRMs and setting that sort of corresponding counting values to work effectively. This also could affect our default PRM and counting rules processes to the degree that we are providing a default to local regulatory authorities who haven't set their own. You know, this is like one of our proposals could be sort of impacting that. But as I think Anya alluded to before, the last topic was really with respect to the kind of this question where stakeholders are largely split on how will this affect the ISO's program design and potentially reshaping or eliminating our resource availability incentive mechanism if this type of proposal was adopted. So if you're willing to flip to the next slide, slide 23. We did a little outreach, and I recognize that this is not complete. Like each one of these, but we reached out to like the ISO New England and PJM. And we're really just trying to get kind of a high-level feel. We recognize that both of them had gone through sort of significant RA reform processes, or were currently in discussions with our stakeholders for ISO reforms, especially ISO New England. And so we're trying to figure out, like, to what degree, how are you dealing with ambient D rates? How are you looking at different incentive mechanisms? How are you doing capacity accreditation? So we thought we might want to have a brief discussion and sort of fit some of those pieces together. So, kind of if I'm looking at ISO New England and some of the, what they're considering as a part of their discussion is sort of really moving from a sort of current ICAP design from thermal to a more of a marginal, ELCC accreditation approach for all resources, which will include addressing, use limitations. Part of their modeling tries to address correlations of outages due to fuel insufficiency, which is certainly a larger issue in the Northeast, as well as having sort of seasonal values. One thing I think that we've alluded to before, almost every market we reach out to has some process of determining sort of, ambient D rates or having a seasonal value for capacity sort of at a minimum that reflects sort of testing of what they're able to produce in different seasons. If we want to go to the next one on PJM, it's kind of a similar story in terms of what was proposed and adopted by FERC in terms of some of the PJM capacity reforms. We're willing to switch to slide 24. Yeah, so we also did a little outreach with PJM to discuss sort of their program design, and we looked at kind of the core of sort of what their rationale was. Is they really wanted to adapt their capacity program, including the modeling, the design, and incentive mechanisms to really address to address and understand what are the risks leading to outages, including really kind of digging into, correlations between different outage types, whether or not, in effect, when you have these, often these are winter events where, it might be a case of a significant amount of the gas fleet could be lost due to sort of correlated outages associated with cold temperatures. And so PJM, adopted basically a marginal ELCC, looking at sort of different scenarios and correlations on performance under sort of this a variety of scenarios, including some of those extreme events. We also reached out to them. They also had the same sort of topic in terms of doing some sort of binding testing for the summer season, June to August, but sort of allowing that to be potentially relaxed during the winter months based on increased availability in other seasons. They had it as a part of their proposal and was accepted by FERC, additional testing for both summer and winter for the accreditation. But for the winter testing, it was less about ambient D rates. It was more about operational factors and the ability to ramp and perform under different circumstances. But they also kind of acknowledged that sort of inherently, as a part of their ELCC modeling, they really were capturing the ambient D rates as well, because that was sort of built into the modeling that they were doing, and the results that would come out of the ELCC value already had that ambient D rate factored in. If we wanted to go to sort of the last slide, and this is kind of sort of puts some of those pieces together, or at least in terms of some of the RAIN discussion. So we're willing to go to slide 25, please. Both PJM and New England currently, and sort of on an ongoing basis, sort of viewed their pay for performance structure, which I'd say has a lot of parallels to RAIN in terms of the design being sort of a self-funding mechanism trying to incentivize availability, but they viewed that as really sort of complementary to their accreditation mechanisms. And so I imagine most of you are fairly familiar, or much more familiar than I am, in terms of these different design elements and how they're working. But for others, really what the pay for performance is doing is providing kind of a payment rate by resources that are underperforming to resources that are overperforming. And that the value of this was like, it looked like a fairly high, the way at least I sort of translated was like, this looked like a fairly high scarcity price that was being applied, where if you were performing below your value, you would basically be sort of hit with this penalty price. If you're performing above it, you'd be basically given sort of this incentive payment that looked like a very high scarcity price. So it looks somewhat like a call option on capacity at some strike price. And so different rates, it sounded like that PJM had, was roughly at $3,500 for our outreach, while ISO New England had much higher value for that. Kind of the other sort of key design elements I found interesting were like, they're both sort of triggered specifically by reserve events, where they had basically penalty factors triggering insufficient reserves in the area. Obviously, the way we do RAIN today is applying it on a monthly average basis, applied to only a subset of resources, and it's basically trying to do the performance over the case of the month. Well, theirs is really sort of targeting on those specific events where they're actually short resources. It was also done on a percentage basis. So in effect, if a resource had a 1% position of total RA, the ISO, the RTO will be measuring if they're providing 1% of the need. And if they're providing sort of greater than their percentage of the need, they'd be seen as sort of performing well and sort of available, eligible for that incentive type structure. If they're performing poorly, they'd be sort of hit with that deficiency charge and that self-funding mechanism. The other thing I noticed, it sounded like there's very few exceptions to this. Like we've got to some of the details, including, applied to renewables, is applied to wind, solar, storage, thermal resources. And also, that there weren't exceptions, particularly like in both New England and PJM for, long start resources, things like that. Even if the start decision was at the ISO's, was a part of the ISO's decision-making algorithm, that wouldn't necessarily excuse them from being hit with charges if they were not producing or providing either energy or ancillary services during those events. And the last thing I noticed, they both had stop loss provisions, capping losses on a percentage basis, and that was something that was recently sort of had a lot of interest with sort of some of those events and some of the very high penalty levels that certain units were faced for not performing during some of the critical events. So, but yeah, I really wanted to provide this really kind of as an overview.
Yeah, can I jump in here and provide a very different view of this?
Yeah.
I think I have a very different view of how these design, originally these things were said it's going to work like an energy only market, except backwards, that, it's going to just, we'll pay them up front and then charge them when they don't perform, and it'll work out to be similar to an energy only market. But then you got to think about, there were simplistic assumptions in all these designs. And, one thing is, suppose there's transmission congestion and it's uneconomic to buy gas to run your unit. You can still incur millions of dollars of penalties under this design because it was uneconomic for you to buy gas, and it would have been ridiculous and exacerbated gas market conditions if you had, but you get penalties. And this happened during Winter Storm Elliott, where people got penalties even though they were not needed because of overloaded transmission constraints. And the second bullet is not right. PJM can trigger this by declaring an emergency. They declared an emergency for about 10 hours when they had more than adequate reserves and prices were like $1.98, and they imposed millions of dollars of penalties because people didn't buy gas that wasn't needed, and all they were doing was getting free reserves at the cost of the capacity resources, who had to decide whether they wanted to lose $300 a megawatt buying gas or lose $300 a megawatt in penalties. And that's not what would have happened in an energy only market. The other dynamic of this, which is why certain generators like it and others don't, is basically the people who get the money in large part are the people who are in the day-ahead market. So the people who are in the day-ahead market and get cleared get the extra payments when they're still online in real time, whereas the units that weren't cleared to the day-ahead market, even if half their capacity comes online, they end up a loser. And and that's why the coal units and the nuclear units love this. But that's not what would happen in a true energy only market. The other dynamic, which I think we really ought to think about, is the money goes to all the non-ICAP resources, which includes, units inside the market that can't be recalled and sell out. So they're getting paid this money for selling into the market, but they were supporting exports to balancing areas in Duke or TVA because they couldn't be recalled. They weren't ICAP. And, we gotta, all of these things, we gotta think about the model that we're getting into. And, it's, then you get the units that are not online because the ISO didn't call on them in time with the scheduling limit and, the gas scheduling timelines. And yet there was uneconomic for them to operate. So of course they weren't going to buy gas unless they were told to. So, there's a lot of negatives with these units, and they're not the same as an energy only market, and they're not the same as, even having a capacity market with strong energy incentives. So that's, I think we really got to look into the consequence of these designs and think about them in terms of California and its resources in the West. And I think there was an assumption, for one thing, that whenever we had an emergency in PJM, we wouldn't be exporting, but they were exporting thousands of megawatts during Elliott. So people were incurring penalties on, PJM ratepayers are going to have to pay high capacity prices to cover the risk of exports to other balancing areas. And the exports were way below the cost of gas. So it was a double kick in the ass for the, the ratepayers in PJM.
that's a really good context. And what I was going to end with, just to make sure it's clear to everyone, this isn't a proposal, obviously, by the ISO. So this is kind of like very preliminary research on kind of what other folks are doing. So that context is really helpful to understand sort of how it's working in practice. And I'll
Right, I
open it up to
understand
others.
you're not proposing it, but I just want to, this was the PJM and the ISO New England always say it's just working great, but we ought to have understand all the things we're getting into when we start talking about this and think about what elements we don't and what elements we do. And PJM's design works so badly during Elliott, they've been forced by stakeholders coming with pitchforks and knives to change the ability of them to just declare an emergency and impose these penalties because it led to such absurd outcomes. So, we just need to learn from all of these what actually works there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thanks, Scott. And I noticed that Kathleen has her hand raised. I imagine she might have please go ahead. I'd love to hear if you all had some. I know that you all were an active participant in those as well. I read some, or at least from my review, I read some of your positions and comments for Vistra. But yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, no, thank you, Partha. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. And I'll start with, Scott, thank you for jumping in and providing that extra context. I think all that was really helpful. So in the PJM world, they call this a capacity performance framework. I was going to clarify that's what we were talking about. But so I think we're talking about CP, right? And everything that Scott just said, as an entity that participates in most of the FERC jurisdictional markets, including PJM, that's something that my company is very familiar with. We definitely have views on the theory behind these things, but what I raised my hand to add a similar context that Scott ended on, but I'll frame it from our perspective, or my perspective, which is regulatory certainty versus regulatory uncertainty is a really important part of like a healthy market, right? And so the CP framework exists. It does have penalties associated with it, and there are transfers of those non-performance charges from those that underperformed to those that overperformed. There's also bonus payments for performing above and beyond that under the design. And some of the challenges Scott raised, which led to individuals losing confidence in the just and reasonableness of that, did lead to quite a few complaints being submitted to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, complaints on the design. All the complaints had different flavors, is my understanding. I'm not a PJM stakeholder anymore, so I don't know the specifics of them. But my understanding at a high level is that they all carried slightly different flavors. Scott touched on a few of them that raised concerns. The export one hit me really hard because of our experiences in California. So honestly, when I heard a lot of what was unfolding, I thought back to 2020. I thought back to a lot of the reports that I've seen on how interties are being managed by our market. And I thought about it in the context, frankly, of storage, because we have both gas and storage in California, but we have been seeing those challenges, right, with exports being supported by storage even this past summer. And so a lot of this has really been hitting me as analogous, at least from the challenges in the operational space. So I'll flag that. But the thing from a regulatory certainty is that certain participants lost confidence. They filed complaints. There was a settlement at FERC, and that settlement has been approved, which has resulted in reducing those payments by, I think, roughly 30%. So you mentioned that the penalty was quite high, but folks turned out to not believe. Some folks didn't feel that penalty was just and reasonable after it occurred. And this has already been settled, and I'm not trying to provide an opinion on what came out of FERC, but to note that market design that parties don't have confidence in that can lead to penalties being incurred, and then after that, parties going to complain about them at FERC is not a durable design. So part of what I walked away with is not only the operational concerns of when they're triggered need to be like very closely looked at, but also that the level, if the level of the penalties are so high that entities aren't actually willing or able to pay them, that becomes a huge problem if it leads to FERC litigation like this. So I just want to note that there's a ton more context about that. This has actually been called into question in a very serious way, and the settlement was approved. So FERC has provided some indication that they agree that the levels were too high, and that needs to be considered if it's, you know, talked about in this venue. I'm happy, Scott, if you want to add anything. I know you're closer to it than I am, but that's just my perspective.
Oh, and I agree with your comments, Kathleen. We got to think about how this stuff works for California and storage, and are we going to penalize our storage resources because they get depleted to support exports? And you know, that's the thing about this. It's a very unguided missile, and we want to think through and I agree also with your comments about certainty. We don't want to come up with a design that really doesn't work, and therefore we're going to have to fudge around the edges constantly, which is going to make, you know, mush the incentives. And people that truly badly perform don't get the full penalties, and people who did perform well don't get the benefits, but also people that could have performed but didn't get hit with penalties. So, you know, it'd be better to work out the details of this design and think about all the downsides and how it relates to California and the West generally, in drawing upon these other designs.
Great, thank you. I appreciate hearing your thoughts. And thank you, Partha.
Okay. Kathleen, thanks for joining us. As my comment with Devin, it's always good to hear you back at our meetings. Okay, Partha. Unless we have somebody else on the phone lines, let's carry on.
There's no more questions. All queues are empty.
Okay. So was that the last slide?
That was the last slide. So yeah, I think if we have a half an hour left, I think that Jim is up next. So yeah,
okay, that's right. I didn't realize this was the end, and so we should give you applause. Thank you for what you and Anya put together. And Jim, pass this on to you.
Okay, great. So just as background, folks, I listened to the stakeholder forum about 10 days ago, I believe it was, and in particular, there was a panel that I thought was really helpful for me, at least in the afternoon. I know Peter was on that, and I think Perry and a couple other people, and I was sort of shouting. I was driving. I was shouting at my phone, you know, and this is me sort of channeling some of my own reactions. So the level here is sort of informal in that sense. Next slide, please. So I think it was Carrie in that stakeholder forum who went through the list of objectives that were originally articulated that led to the development of the RAIM mechanism, which was I thought really helpful, and I kind of had been trying to structure my thinking about this UCAP performance incentive, and I'm not sure what to call it all. It's just I used the acronym for the initiative here, but in general, I thought the stated objectives that Partha started with are really high level, and I wanted to focus a little bit more on sort of what an improved UCAP and/or performance incentives could do, or why we'd be interested in them. I don't think this is an exhaustive list, but this is sort of where I was trying to parse them. And the first one is just trying to get a more realistic measurement of what of the capacity we're procuring, and a more realistic expectation of what kind of contribution to reliability it would provide in aggregate, as a portfolio, as a fleet of resources. Another would be more of a focused incentive to specific resources, and here I tried to make the distinction between what I call physical availability, which would include things like derates, forced outages. The whole point here is, to what extent are these things under the control of resources where stronger incentives can improve performance? And really, there's both the improving the aggregate statistics, but more importantly, trying to reduce the outages or increase availability when it really matters, and defining when it really matters is always a challenge here. And then one of the wild cards here that Scott's alluded to in the gas context, but you could also sort of wrap into really certainly renewables and also even storage, arguably, is fuel availability. Is that a form of physical availability? And who should be responsible for that? If you can't procure gas, or if the wind's not blowing, what kind of responsibility should be borne by that? And I think different approaches have different attitudes about that. So I try to, again, make this distinction between physical availability and market availability. I believe when Carrie was talking about RAIN, there was a similar sort of distinction about this, where in addition to just being available, there's always been this endless goal in the CAISO market, probably other markets as well, of trying to encourage participation in terms of bidding flexibly, as opposed to just self-scheduling rigidly or not bidding at all. And then also in the case of energy limited and storage resources, there's the management of that energy that is part of a market availability calculus here. I'll get back to this. Of course, the issue is also how much of this is, again, within the control of the resource, particularly in the storage resource context, versus something that the market software is forcing on them. And then a third thing that I want to touch on is portfolio resources in the California context. That's really imports, and trying to provide an incentive for those imports to be both real and reliable. And I think that's always been a huge issue with our RA system. We have kind of a very blunt solution to it in place right now, and I've always wondered, or I've hoped that maybe a stronger incentive mechanism could provide a bit more of a equally effective, but maybe less costly sort of solution to that import problem. And then, a fourth one would be maybe it's too utopian, but ideally you'd have an objective technology neutral metrics that would be applied across all these different polyglot resources that tries to capture their true contribution to reliability. All right, so that was my list. People can chime in offline or online later about whether what else or what should be or should not be on this list. But I wanted to sort of frame the UCAP options and the performance options in terms of how they sort of fit this list of potential goals here. Next slide, please. We've heard a lot already, so I'm going to go quick over the next couple slides. I just tried to, I guess the reason I put these two slides together, which everybody's going to be sort of, everybody's already knows this stuff, but I was really trying to highlight the fact that there are a lot of things that are within the design control of specific ISOs and or regulators that can make either approach, a performance incentive approach or a UCAP approach, better or worse. And so I wanted to just start with a very high level here to just highlight the distinctions and then try to talk about some of the design elements afterwards. All right, so UCAP I think of as, there's a metric of availability. It's backward looking in the sense that we're looking generally at your performance in a previous period, and that's affecting how much capacity you can sell in the current or forthcoming periods. It can be plant specific. I wanted to say it's usually plant specific, but I don't know for sure if that's true. Certainly there's been discussions about whether it would be plant specific or just more broadly applied across specific technologies, like say combined cycle gas plants or something like that. So there's degrees to which this could be honed in on specific resources or more of a class thing. Usually, I think this is a continual course of revision of these sorts of things. It's focused on a subset of what of periods that a system operator considers important for reliability. Because this is you're sort of looking at previous periods. Generally, you're trying to balance this kind of ideal of knowing when it was really important last year, when there was actually a reliability event, but also if a unit just happened to not be available, if there was just 1 hour of a reliability event in the previous year, and an otherwise fully reliable, usually reliable unit just happened to not be available in that 1 hour, then that's probably, you don't want to derate that plant by its full capacity just because it happened to be out in that 1 hour. That's an extreme example of, I think, one of the challenges of trying to come up with, let's call it a sample size over which to measure a UCAP's performance, that you want to be big enough to sort of have a reasonable sense of what their probabilistic future availability would be, but you also don't want to make it so broad that you're going to be looping in all this performance during periods that you really don't think of as particularly important in terms of contribution to system reliability. And perhaps there's a similar challenge with performance, but I think performance is cleaner in that sense, but it shifts the risk in a way that may be problematic. I think the idea here with UCAP is because the penalty that is really being incurred for an availability shortfall is in essence devaluing the amount of RA you can sell in future years, and so you're basically linking, the penalty is linked to next year's RA or next month's RA, depending on the frequency here. And that can be better than just fixing a number and never going back and changing it, which is kind of where RAIM has fallen. But to the extent that RA values are cyclical, and maybe this year is a really tight year and next year might not be, that also might be an issue in terms of there is still a lag there that can be potentially concerning. Usually in RA, we have kind of more of a slower adjustment process in prices, and so maybe that's not a concern. Next slide, please. So contrasting that to, and again, very high level performance incentives here. We had this discussion, Partha and Scott and Kathleen set it up well. I want to sort of take a step back and highlight the many ways in which you could kind of think of tweaking performance incentives. All right, so it is based upon resource availability in a specific hour or interval. And I think as someone who has been seduced by the appeal of potential performance incentives as maybe an imperfect substitute for higher scarcity prices, I've gotten previews of Scott's issues with specific incentives. I've been trying to think about, are there ways to try to mitigate or eliminate some of the problems that have been highlighted with these mechanisms. And so just here, there's various definitions for defining what available is. It could be bidding into the day-ahead market. And if you don't clear the day-ahead market, then you are not expected to procure gas for the following day, for example, to the extent we think that is a critical issue. I'm not sure how that works with things like the renewables or storage. You'd have to be thinking about how the cost of imbalances factor into that as well, so that you're not just selling in the day-ahead market to avoid the penalty and then just going in balance. So there are some issues there, but there may be ways to try to deal with that sort of gas procurement issue. And then there are various options for defining important performance periods, and I do think it's a good point that you want this to be an objective and transparent criterion. And that does seem to be one of the complaints about at least the PJM mechanism, is that it wasn't as transparent and predictable as it could have been. I'm not in a position to sort of judge that, but it is a concerning characteristic to the extent it's not transparent and objective. The current performance impacts, are basically in real time. And this is the real appeal of it. Instead of trying to anticipate when we will need a resource in a probabilistic sense, it is very much of, oh, well, we know when we need you. It's when we need you because it's happening or it just happened. Again, I tend to think of the two approaches. One is sort of focused on valuing on average reliability when measurements can be done correctly. And the other is more of an on-demand availability paradigm for resource adequacy. I think there's arguments for both paradigms, but there is definitely, I think, a cleaner measurement in terms of, hey, you were on. If we had an objective criterion for what was a performance period, we can just sort of say, all right, well, you sold this amount of RA and your performance was above or below that. So that measurement is cleaner in a sense. The magnitudes of the penalties are usually some administrative value, as Partha kind of hinted at. It's often portrayed as sort of an adder to a scarcity price, and has been kind of conveyed as a form of at least higher scarcity prices on sellers. Scott highlighted some of the ways in which that's not fully true. And for better or worse, it can provide incentives to non-RA capacity. It doesn't necessarily have to, but in practice, these payments have gone to non-RA capacity. And I think this is in part to try to deal with the fact that selling RA does take on a lot more risk. And one of the potential advantages of this is you are sort of reducing the aggressiveness to which a resource might push its RA onto the market beyond what it might actually think is capable. And to the extent they reduce the amount they're selling into the RA market, they still have an incentive to make that non-RA capacity available, just like a higher energy price would. I think the export issue is a very important one that has to be thought of here in terms of what we want to be eligible or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so we've already had some of this discussion, but I just wanted, I've been, again, as somebody who's sort of been seduced by the appeal of some of these strong performance incentives, I've really wanted to know kind of, and I've heard some big dissatisfaction with them too, and I've been trying to really parse what are the complaints, are there ways to try to address them? And one real source of controversy is exactly what types of availability should be, if any, exempt from this? Is it forced outages? I think everybody sort of thinks of as something that should be within the control. Fuel availability is a bit more controversial. State of charge would be really controversial to the extent that the state of charge is viewed to be beyond the control of the resource. I think there's definitely a balance that needs to be made there in terms of when you're increasing the responsibility of availability, you need to also allow the resource to be able to manage its availability in a much more unilateral, flexible way. There's issues in terms of risk. It's already been talked about, the stop loss, the regulatory risk, how real are these penalties? And then there's the issue that's been raised about how transparent, objective, what a performance period is, how predictable, how transparent the declaration of a performance period is as well. Okay, so another issue I've heard, particularly in the PJM context where there is a lot of market power mitigation of RA, is the risk of these penalties needs to be factored into the cost of selling RA, and to the extent that we're mitigating the offer price of resource adequacy, that it's really problematic, because capturing the cost of that risk is pretty hard to do, and so that's just been an issue that I think we would also need to kind of think about when we think about things like soft offer caps as well. Credit requirements, to the extent these are really large potential liabilities, there's definite sorts of requirements that try to manage that sort of thing. And So are we back to just saying we should just have higher scarcity prices and that's the way to provide incentives? I think there's definitely an appeal there. We've been talking about it for a long time. It seems in some ways there is resistance for both market power concerns, for other maybe less concrete concerns about higher scarcity prices. And then we do need to ask ourselves what we should require of capacity, whether there should be any kind of hedging element there, or what are we getting out of capacity if we are still mostly relying on energy prices for our performance. And I do think, to the extent that this dynamic we've always talked about, that higher scarcity, higher energy prices should reduce prices of capacity. Whenever you draw out an equilibrium model of capacity markets, the idea is there's a shortfall of revenues to maintain a competitive ongoing amount of capacity. And the more money you could get out of energy and ancillary service markets, the less you should need from your capacity market. To the extent we are seeing lower prices of capacity on average over a longer period with higher energy prices, then we can, then the fact that we're maybe not getting much for a capacity payment in terms of just a must offer arrangement and maybe ability to curtail exports, then maybe that's fine. But we do need to sort of actually think about the prices of capacity and what we're getting for it. And if for whatever reason we're not able to get higher enough scarcity prices, performance capacity can create a more focused and higher incentive if there are ways to try to overcome some of the problems that have been highlighted. All right, next slide, please. To take this a little closer to some of the topics that have been discussed here, I think it's been raised, but to the extent that people are thinking about UCAP, the way I think about it is UCAP can solve some of the issues on my list, but not others, and therefore they're not really perfect substitutes. I think theoretically performance can maybe work back, and to the extent firms are fully incentivized to offer kind of what they objectively think of as their capabilities, maybe that leads to better representations. But in every market that's had performance, they've still wanted to do some type of capacity limitation. It doesn't seem unreasonable to want to do that. And I'll get back to, I think one of the appeals of performance is it can encourage units to self-edit themselves, even if the accounting rules give them too generous a rating, that a performance penalty can cause them to not be too aggressive in pushing the envelope of what they're allowed to do. There's an interesting or frustrating, or however you want to put it, institutional aspect to California's RA and these issues having to do with the fact that the PUC is in a more difficult position trying to manage ongoing performance penalties. That's generally been the CAISO's rubric because they're the ones managing hourly and daily availability decisions and settlements. And so maybe we're ending up with UCAP largely because that's kind of what the PUC can do. And they would have a much more difficult time trying to style something that looks like a performance penalty, or there would have to be this coordination, continued coordination, improved and increased coordination between the PUC and the ISO in that sense. My understanding, I'm still not fully sure where we're at with this, but that the PUC's proposal, at least initially, was going to be not plant specific. It was going to be resource category level. And part of the reason for that, again, I'm not 100% sure if this was true, but what I got out of the calls was that there was some data confidentiality issues having to do with trying to transmit individual performance information from units that was part of that. So if we are doing just resource category levels, that's not necessarily a terrible thing. It addresses issue number one on the list. And I think the earlier discussion was all about, well, maybe issue number one is the big problem we have here. We're just kind of giving too much credit in terms of ambient capabilities or even just known forced outage rates to resources that everybody knows are wrong. And if we just sort of get rid of these more generous assumptions about what certain types of capacity can do, then we've solved X% of the problem, where X might be a very large number. I do think this is something that that further analysis can shed light on. One other thought that came up just in today's discussion about this as well is, to the extent that correlation, and this has been an issue with all the RA tasks, we have increasingly correlated outages. The onset of variable energy resources has been the sort of extreme version of this, but to the extent that high temperatures, gas availability, and these other things had led outages really, or availability, to be a problem that affects entire categories of resources simultaneously, rather than a pure forced outage rate that could be thought of as random. That's been one of the issues with UCAP. If we do treat these things as sort of independent draws, then we definitely have to sort of that's probably not right, and we have to sort of think about how that affects things like PRM. But maybe a UCAP that is categorical can have an advantage in the sense of capturing some of these correlations. The thought that just occurred to me during today. And then just the last point, a small one, in terms of, to the extent we're doing UCAP at a category level instead of a plant-specific level because of data confidentiality issues. Maybe this is just naive, but it seems like a rule that says, hey, if you want to sell capacity in California, you have to tell us your availability data. Could that be a way around these sorts of issues? Next slide, please. And then as far as RAIM, or whatever else we want to call it, I do think there's still a role for an incentive mechanism. There are issues not covered by UCAP that, at least in the past, have thought to be of concern. I think we can maybe, with some more numbers, get a sense of just how big a deal those things are or not. But there are market performance conserves that could be helped by stronger incentives. And again, I want to circle back to import RA. This has been an issue that's long been a problem, in the sense of, if you bid RA into the market and get paid $1,000 a day ahead and then don't perform, there isn't really much of a penalty. And so we tried to address that by having a must bid at basically must import kind of level. And the potential inefficiencies of a rule like that have always been a concern. I haven't really seen an analysis about exactly how big a problem those types of import rules have created or not created. But it does seem like a stronger performance incentive on specifically imports is a more elegant way of trying to deal with that specific problem. There are energy limited and storage issues. There are also kind of market performance concerns, but especially with those, we would need to navigate concerns about market dispatch that would be out of control of the resource. And then lastly, I already made this point earlier, but I do think it's one that I was asking Partha about earlier in terms of the seasonal D rates as well. He made well, we talked about it. There was this possible implication that firms were pushing the envelope less aggressively in terms of how much capability they were selling, and were kind of self-derating based seasonally, because RAIM was maybe more of an issue when capacity prices were lower, and that's maybe evidence that this can have some issue. But we're never going to get the accounting mechanisms fully right, and to the extent that accounting mechanism is overly generous to certain resource categories, having performance incentives that penalize a firm for selling too much in a way that's unrealistic to their own expectations is a way of trying to at least backstopping poorly designed or slowly adjusting capacity crediting mechanisms. Last slide, please. Or maybe this was the last. Oh no, I did have one other. Okay, so just some specific things about RAIM. I heard on that stakeholder call at least some stakeholders still interested in some type of incentive mechanism. Maybe it's RAIM, maybe it's something else. But I do think there's clearly a sense that the penalty needs to be higher, and it needs to be kind of somehow linked to either current RA or energy prices in a way that we don't just fix it and just assume it's going to be a sufficient incentive. There's been this ongoing concern, or it was a concern certainly several years ago, in terms of we have resources that are actually procured as capacity, but are deterred from showing because of one or the other types of RAIM concerns. That's probably less of a concern now that RAIM is considered less punitive. And are there better ways to do that? One thought would be portfolio evaluations where an LSE, or maybe it's a fleet of resources, are evaluated in terms of their aggregate performance rather than on a unit specific level in a way that's more elegant than how RAIM does it now. I think, I forget who it was, but somebody mentioned that more frequent opportunities for substitution would be another way of trying to at least mitigate some of this, because plants might have a week-long planned outage, and if you have to either substitute for a whole month or not, you're kind of stuck in that sort of thing. So having more granular ways to substitute would be helpful there. And then alternative performance metrics, rather than just having generic performance over the RAIM hours during a month, I think would be useful. They need to be objective and transparent, but one that's focused on hours of stress. And just a couple ideas here, an extreme would be just power balance constraint relaxation, but we are already facing this issue in terms of the resource sufficiency evaluation and the penalties associated with failure of that. And there's already been some recognition that the cost allocation of those RSE failures, specifically for the CAISO system, maybe shouldn't be just generically shared, that they could be shared more specifically to either LSEs or resources that are viewed as contributing to that failure because of their lack of availability. So I do think there's a bunch of ways in trying to better focus those performances that can make, I think, the incentive mechanisms a useful component here. All right, and I'll end there. And I don't know if we're going to have any time for discussion, but thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Tim, for that presentation. And so I think, let's see, let me first just check with Scott. Is there anything you want to add at this point before we go to the lines?
Just one distinction I want to make sure we keep in mind that Partha made early on. UCAP has two roles. One is that it's a counting rule. It's not just a performance rule. And, Partha mentioned that a unit that's only 50% available 50% of the time under a UCAP could only sell, if it's a 100 megawatt unit, it can only sell 50 megawatts. So, it couldn't buy that much, and an LSE couldn't, we adjust what we're buying to, performance, and LSEs wouldn't buy a unit that they'd only get 50 megawatts of capacity, not 100. So, a low price might not be as attractive if it only gets half as much capacity. And then we also have the performance on the other side of incenting the resource to perform in the hour. But I think we need to think of the counting rule aspect of it too, and how much capacity do we need, and the value of capacity to LSEs.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I meant to sort of convey that. In fact, I think that where the current PUC UCAP proposal seems to be going is almost exclusively as a counting rule, that the performance incentive aspects of it, to the extent they would be shared across broad resource categories, are going to be pretty weak. If your own plant outages is going to be diluted in terms of the sort of fleet's performance.
Right. We don't want the bad unit to get to sell 90% of its, capacity just because other units are good.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, Scott. We do have Kathleen on the phone lines, and maybe some other hands as well. So let's turn to there, and I'll ask Kathleen if you could get right to the point, because time is short. And why don't you go ahead, operator?
Okay, thank you. I think I'm unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. So very briefly, I had a question for the MSC and actually just specifically an ask for future discussion. So I think the concept of scarcity pricing is being discussed in the price formation effort.
Mm-hmm.
You've perfectly explained why it's so important in the framework of incentivizing performance or increasing consequences for unavailability of resources, right? What I'd like to ask, if it's possible, is I'm working on trying to better understand the value of loss of load. Studies that have been, there's been some recent studies, academic studies on vol, and I think it's gaining traction kind of more in the academic space. So I thought it would be a reasonable ask of the MSC to consider if in a future meeting, maybe you could all kind of think about the appropriate penalty prices or prices to send the signal of the value of loss of load under a scarcity condition. So it's just a request for a future discussion on that. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that since it is a live issue and gaining traction in the academic space too.
Sure.
No need to answer, just an ask.
Yeah, I'll just say that, you know, unfortunately, we think of vol as a number, and there's just so many. So first of all, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, like there's so many different. Everybody has their own vol, and you know, within an individual application, even individual appliances have very different sort of vol implications. And then there's just the dimensions in terms of you know, length of outage, advance warning of outage, and so I hear you. We need to ground this in something that has some rational sort of boundary, but I think we also need to recognize sort of the limits of what the academic studies can really tell us in terms of how we would map that to a number that we need for a maximum scarcity price, for example.
And I think that would be super helpful for the community to understand as we're going to be kind of thinking through if we want to change what those signals are. And so I appreciate you considering if there's a way for the MSC to kind of help guide us in that direction. My second point was on the UCAP, slide 6. I really like the way you broke this out of the CPUC is a better position to manage the UCAP style approach. I strongly agree with that. I also think it's the right venue to have this discussion on UCAP. We're going to be asking for a UCAP working group and hoping the CAISO brings itself into that working group forum for the UCAP discussion. You mentioned this issue about default class average versus unit performance. There's a new master resource database. It is informed by the net qualifying capacity list. All of the values are going to be public that can be transacted around RA under this master resource database. So how I understand it is right now, the idea is that the CPUC would start with the default class average, and the CPUC has asked CAISO to think about how it might help add into that framework some kind of unit-specific performance, which is why we believe we need a working group at the CPUC for everyone to come together and work on that, right? Our ideal would be a default class average, CPUC sets up, and then resources can go to the CAISO and ask for a specific kind of test or analysis to see if a specific performance adjustment would be merited. And through asking for that unit-specific adjustment to be included, we would be acknowledging we understand it's going to show up on the public NQC list and the public master resource database. And so we think that kind of resolves the confidentiality issues of starting with a class average as a default and allowing for folks who know that they're not a good representation of the average to ask for adjustments.
I see. And so there's kind of an unwinding dynamic there where the really reliable units will ask to have their own, and then.
Yeah, and that's why we need a working group and to work on these over a few years as the CPUC, but I just wanted to throw that out. Thank you.
I'll just say that, that bullet was unintentionally clever in the sense that, yes, the PUC may be better positioned for UCAP, but I guess it was much better to say that the PUC is not well positioned to do performance incentives as well. And so While I didn't necessarily mean to say the PUC is better positioned than the CAISO, but that's probably true in the sense that the PUC is the ultimate arbiter of the RA sort of compliance in the current scheme. But I also meant to say that the PUC is better positioned to do UCAP than it is performance incentives.
Okay. Thanks, Jim. Kathleen, and Jim, what you meant by the unwinding is that what would be left in the class would be the poor performing resources.
Right. So with any unwinding sort of setup, you need to adjust the average to reflect the fact that the good ones have left. And then that kind of leaves, as the average gets worse, then more plants want to sort of get their own plant specific score.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Like the classic market for lemons paper, if I'm not mistaken. Thank you, Kathleen. Operator, do we have any other
I think
anybody
Chris
else on the
has
phone?
his hand up.
Sorry?
I see Chris.
Devon is unmuted.
Oh, okay, great.
Thanks, Chris Devon, TerraGen again. I'll keep it brief, but I did just want to chime in. Really good thoughts here. Thanks for the presentation, Jim. I definitely concur with the idea about this whole resource-specific issue. Obviously, I think suppliers would prefer it to be resource-specific. I think load should probably, also prefer it to be resource-specific if possible. But I think you got to the point there that I wanted to comment on already, which was, if we do have that approach that Kathleen and you were just discussing, then there could be a good outcome as you start to do that adjustment, that you reflected there. So I won't beat a dead horse there on that one. I did want to focus my comments on the storage issues. I think this is a very important thing for storage. We have a significant storage fleet in California. TerraGen is a large owner of storage and hybrid resources. I think you have to be really careful about things like the fact that there's a lot of churn and discussion right now about how much storage is really available. And I think a lot of the unavailability that's been commented on, like in that DMM slide deck that they presented at one of those last RA workshops, was I thought a quite misleading analysis, or at least maybe just needed some caveats and some more details being provided on the exact things that are going into that unavailability, because there's a lot of things about the CAISO's market design that actually causes storage to become unavailable. And I think all of these command and control things that CAISO's done with the ASSOC and a lack of focus on some of the market design enhancements that are needed to accurately reflect the true constraints that storage have not been spent enough time on in the policy development and the market design. So we've talked about them a lot for the last 4-6 years now, and we've gotten very little done, unfortunately, I think. And so I would say, things that are causing the SOC of units to be depleted and then made unavailable, that there is really very little that the resource owners are able to actually do to protect against those things, and that it is driven by the market outcomes, and the fact that there's some unfortunate things that are not yet addressed, like the foldback issues, and I think even further than that, some of these bidding things like the Order 831 bidding bid cap issues. And so I would just caution the CAISO and MSC to try to think hard about these market design elements that really should not be reflected in UCAP if there are going to be applied for storage, and that one is a big one that's very concerning to us. So I'll leave it with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Let's see, Jim or Scott, you want to make any response to Chris? I have none.
No, I agree with Chris. I
Except-
think storage is a complicated thing to deal with in these designs. And then PJM, my understanding is the pump storage couldn't charge overnight because PJM was using the excess capacity to supply exports, and therefore you know, then they become eligible for penalties because they don't have any water, but it was a decision PJM made. And, you know, if we go to a slice of day, you know, if there isn't enough, if the solar doesn't perform and there isn't enough, then obviously the storage can't charge. So it becomes very complicated, but that's also true in an energy only market. If there isn't enough solar, you know, to charge the battery, well, there's nothing you can do. You aren't going to make the money.
Yeah, and the prices will go up, and there won't be as much money to be made. That's for sure. Let's see, operator. Anybody else on the phone lines?
No, all lines are empty.
Okay. All right. Well, we've gone beyond the scheduled closing time for the meeting. Covered the presentations. We've had a lot of really valuable discussion, which I think is a good basis for continuing this and addressing the issues and the questions that I outlined at the beginning. So looking forward to a continuation of this discussion next time we get together. We don't have a date yet to announce on that, but I'm sure we will shortly. So thanks to the stakeholders who joined us. Thanks to the staff, Anya and Partha for preparing the slides, and Jim for your slides, and Scott for your discussion. And with that, I think we'll close the meeting. Operator, thank you very much. And we'll see everybody next time.